Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar, The Answer, My Friend, Wind, Pollination, How and Why. My name is Stacy Matrazo. I'm the Executive Director of the Florida Wildflower Foundation. For those of you not familiar with our organization, our mission is to protect, connect, and expand native wildflower habitat through our education, research, planting, and conservation programs. Our work is made possible primarily through the sale and renewal of the Florida State Wildflower License Plate. This is our old look. Here's our new look, new-ish look. Whether you have the old or new license plate, you are supporting our foundation and our work, and we thank you. Funds from the sale and renewal of the license plate, as well as donations and memberships, allow us to support and create projects, that build awareness and knowledge of native wildflowers and plants throughout Florida. We'd like to encourage those of you who find our programs valuable to consider becoming a member, making a donation, or purchasing that state wildflower license plate. And if you do have or purchase the plate, you are eligible for a membership with our foundation. You just need to let us know that you have the tag and we will get you set up in our database. Be sure to check out our website for resources on planting and growing wildflowers, to learn where to see wildflowers in bloom, learn about our upcoming events, and so much more. We're also on social media. You can find us on most platforms at FLA Wildflowers. Our webinar for next month will be presented by Tina McIntyre, the Florida-friendly landscaping agent with Seminole County's UF IFAS Extension. Her topic will be native plants to attract wildlife. That's on Wednesday, April 19th at 2 p.m. You can register on our website. We have some great field trips coming up too this weekend. We'll be in the Everglades National Park. That trip is sold out, unfortunately, or fortunately for those of you who are registered. It's going to be a great trip with Roger Hammer. But on March 26th, we will be discovering the biodiversity of Markham Park in Sunrise with University of Florida professor Corey Callahan and Florida Wildflower Foundation board member CJ McCartney. They will lead an exploration of a biodiverse nature trail and help identify the interesting wildlife in the area, utilizing iNaturalist and eBird. You can register for that on our website. And on Saturday, April 8th, we'll be touring the meadow restoration site at Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery near Gainesville. The meadow restoration was funded in part by the Florida Wildflower Foundation's Viva Florida Landscape Demonstration Garden Grant Program. So come out and see how Prairie Creek is working to restore biodiversity in this very serene and special place. You can register for that and all of our field trips and webinars on our website. Be sure to follow us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter to stay abreast of all of our activities. Just have a couple of housekeeping items to go over before we get started. All attendees are muted and cameras are turned off. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature. You can submit them at any point during the presentation. Yes, the chat is active, but we will not be monitoring it for questions. Please use the Q&A. We will address questions with our presenter at the end of the talk as time permits. And if your question is not answered, you can email it to us and we will make sure that an answer is given to you. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website and our YouTube channel in about 24 to 48 hours. When it's available, you'll also receive an email from us with a link to the recording along with the resource page with links from today's webinar. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. James Stevenson has been with us before, so welcome back. James is an Education and Outreach Supervisor with the Parks and Conservation Resources Department in Pinellas County. He works out of the Brooker Creek Preserve Environmental Education Center in Tarpon Springs and teaches classes on a variety of natural resource conservation topics, including plant identification, botany, entomology, ecology, and native plants such as ferns, wetland wildflowers, and epiphytes. James grew up in Clearwater, then went on to university in Tennessee, worked in the Botanic Gardens in North Carolina, then moved to the UK to work with Kew Royal Botanic Gardens and the University of Oxford Botanic Gardens. And he has been back here with Pinellas UF IFAS Extension since 2006. We are very excited to have James back. And without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I will go ahead and share today's presentation. Thank you all for joining us today. I kind of understand this might be a little bit of a niche topic. So well done to those of you who have decided to join us for this idea, this concept, this journey of wind pollination within the plant kingdom. As Stacy was saying, I'm here at Brooker Creek Preserve in Tarpon Springs, Florida. I quite love being tied to our tiny little preserve. Pinellas County is the smallest county in the state, but we are the most densely populated. So our 9,000 acres, which is enormous to us, is minuscule when it is compared to other preserves around the state. And what we have in our preserve is, you know, perilously endangered in our little county. So it's a wonderful place to visit. We do hope you would make some time to come and see us sometime. With IFAS Extension, I am not the one to turn to ask questions about how to grow things. IFAS Extension is more than that. We also address issues like natural resource conservation, which is where we come in, and how to be good stewards of what little natural Florida is left in our urban county. So I would love to talk about growing things, but I would be learning certainly as much as anyone else in that endeavor. I tend to spend my time in the field observing native plants as they grow unassisted. So today's topic, wind pollination, I'm sure that's a topic that's on everyone's mind. It's in everyone's nose. We all kind of get that plants are throwing pollen out into the wind right now. And since you've joined us today, since you opted into learning something about wind pollination, you've got to be somewhere on the nerd spectrum, you know, with all of us. And so let's build on that and give it its proper science name. It's anemophily, the love of wind, basically. So the anemophilous plants that throw their pollen to chance. So we're going to make sure that we all have the same vocabulary going into today's presentation. We're going to be discussing pollen, of course, pollinators, which certainly get a lot of due and necessary attention. And we will be talking about the pollination, the verb, right? The act of pollination. What does that actually mean? How is that manifested? And sometimes it's important to kind of clear these things up in the beginning, you know, make sure we all have the same understanding about the subject at hand. Now, normal people know what pollen is, especially this time of year, because of course it's covering a lot of the surfaces that we would rather not have covered in pollen, in particular, the shiny surfaces of our cars and things like that. So pollen, we get, it's some kind of weird plant dust that is currently occupying quite a lot of our airspace. Normal people also kind of draw a line between pollen and sneezing. The pollen count is something that's very often given in our newscasts. You know, what's the pollen count? That can have a direct impact on how we might be feeling that particular day. People get that as well. And smelling flowers could certainly, in some people's minds, result in this discomfort to the nasal passages. So pollen, of course, is the substance, the material that belongs to flowering plants, and it belongs to the gymnosperms, the conifers. That's the only group of plants, those two groups of plants that produce pollen. It is a reproductive substance, right? It is granular, and its purpose is to send a message from one plant to another plant of the same species. So the pollen is the messenger, and tucked inside these tiny little grains, this message in the bottle is a little sex cell that is meant to get from the donor plant to the receiver plant using whatever mechanism best suits that plant or whatever mechanism is available at the time. The pollinators, of course, when we think of pollinators, we think of insects, we think of bees in particular, and we think of the European honeybee most particularly. And the plight of the European honeybee in North America is, of course, in jeopardy. We have perhaps, well, normal people, again, I'll say it, have got hold of news that the European honeybee populations in North America are endangered due to a variety of stressors that they are under. Number one, being away from home. Number two, being kept in great, huge, dense colonies, unnatural conglomerations of various hives. The stress of that, they're moved around quite a lot. There are, in those unnatural, humongous concentrations of individuals, a disease or a pest or pathogen can certainly rip through colonies that are placed that closely together. And of course, environmental factors like pollution, just general pollution, and in particular, certain pesticides have our European honeybees at risk. Those same stresses can be affecting our native pollinators as well. Just bear that in mind. If people aren't thinking about European honeybees as pollinators, they're very often thinking of butterflies as pollinators. I think I've been here before mentioning that, butterflies really are not good pollinators. They really aren't. They're kind of designed not to get dirty. That's kind of the butterfly's MO, is to stay on its tiptoes when it visits a flower. And it has this ridiculously long proboscis that it can reach past any of that filthy pollen just to steal the nectar from the flower without getting that messy granular dust all over them. So generally speaking, any pollination that's done by butterflies is purely accidental. Other pollinators, and we do get asked when we're doing any sort of presentation on pollination, what about bats? Because again, for some reason, normal people seem to know that bats can be pollinators, and that's quite exciting. A vertebrate, and a flying vertebrate at that, birds and bats. Bats are not active pollinators in Florida. Our native bats did not co-evolve with any of the night flowering species, nor did the species evolve with bats. So we just don't really have the provision. It's not outside the realm of possibilities that a night flowering cactus or one of the other larger flowered plants that are bat pollinated in their normal habitat wouldn't be visited by a bat in Florida, just accidentally, but we don't have that as a real pollination syndrome. So that leaves us with the wind, the last of the vectors for pollen for that message to be sent from one plant to the other. And that leads to the next topic, pollination. So the pollination is the physical transfer of the messenger, the pollen grain, the physical transfer from either one flower to another or from one cone to another in the case of the gymnosperms. And here we have a longitudinal section through a schematic flower, and the pollen is being transferred, being dropped onto this special spot on the flower, and all flowering plants have this special spot that receives the pollen in flowering plants again. Once the pollen lands on this part of the flower, that's the pollination part. The messenger pollen grains then begin to grow. They can actually germinate, and they begin to grow through this long structure here. This long structure here. So landing on the stigma of a flower and growing through what's called the style. So here we are, the pollen grains in orange landing on the stigma in green. Eventually, these will germinate and grow through the style of the flower. In non-flowering plants that produce pollen, and that would be the gymnosperms, or the sometimes referred to as the conifers, although it's not completely restricted to conifers. The same process, in the same message is sent from one gymnosperm to the other by way of the pollen grain. And the pollen in gymnosperms is produced in little cones, little male cones that are brief, and their life cycle is very brief. Their structure is very fragile. They're not kept attached to the plant beyond their useful life. So male cones, once the pollen is shed, are dropped by the tree. So you can find these little male cones kind of littering around areas where you might be living near slash pines or sand pines or longleaf pines, that sort of thing. The female cones, on the other hand, they're perennial, and the pollen is transferred to the female cone, where again we have a union of sperm and egg, and the little seed is formed, and the sporophyte generation emerges from that. It's down to the pollen messenger finding its way blindly to the scale of the female cone where the egg is sitting naked. That's why they're called gymnosperms. The egg is sitting there. Eventually the seed is sitting out there quite naked. I hope everybody's still okay. I don't see anything popping into the Q&A. If you do have any as we go along, as Stacy was saying, please don't hesitate to add something to the Q&A. My intent is to kind of draw us along this journey, making sure we're all on the same page. Having broached the subject of what is pollen in the first place, what is meant by pollinators, and what is the action of pollination, right? Crashing on. So in teaching about plants, I like to give people some confidence that they already know quite a lot. And something that I think anybody could have access to is that there's more than 4 groups, big groups of plants, but there are 4 big mutually exclusive groups of plants. The mosses, which are very easily overlooked, a lecture in and of their own, their life cycles, their natural history is absolutely fascinating, but they're quite forgivably easily overlooked. They are only a few millimeters tall. The ferns as a group, which you probably are familiar with, most people are, they and the mosses both use a very ancient reproductive system utilizing spores. Now, spores are not the same as pollen, even though they are both dust-like. Spores are very specialized cells that germinate and grow into entire plants that can photosynthesize and live independently. It's nuts. We can talk about that in a different lecture another time. So the ferns and the mosses are the spore reproducing plants. And then the gymnosperms and the flowering plants have taken that whole idea of making spores and growing into plants, and they have kind of not simplified, but they've streamlined that. They made it a little bit more efficient, and they retain those plants that the spores grow into on themselves. They don't send them out into the world. So the gymnosperms and the flowering plants have a slightly different way of reproducing, a little bit more advanced, if you will. Certainly more efficient when it comes to the number of propagules. So the gymnosperms, the flowering plants, they have a different reproductive system using pollen. And the air. Not in all cases, because of course the pollinators that we discussed before, the insects and so on, the not butterflies, both of these groups have figured out using the wind for pollination. Now, I did briefly mention that ferns have a different, and the ferns and the mosses have different ways of doing things. But let's move up a little bit in complexity and take a look at what the extant, the living conifers or gymnosperms figured out about 130 million years ago. So this is a scheme that has worked since then. Mature plants produce these cones. Now, in fern reproduction, we know perhaps that the reproductive structures are attached to the leaves of ferns. The fronds get these growths on them that can be quite alarming if you're not in on what could be going on. Well, that concept is kind of taken on in the gymnosperms and the conifers, and those leaves are reduced to little tiny scales at the tips of specialized branches that are then squished into a very compact and efficient size and are the cones. And in the case of the pollen-bearing cones, as I mentioned before, they're temporary and small, and once their job is done, they are released from the plant. But here's a collection of male cones at the tip of a branch, they themselves being modified branches and the scales being modified leaves. And on those scales, in those scales, is produced this messenger, this gametophyte plant, if you will, this soon-to-be free-living gametophyte plant. And in the pines and in other conifers, the pollen, these little gametophytes that have a sperm cell inside, are saccate, S-A-C-C-A-T-E. The pollen can be referred to as sacci, little bags with wings. And so these little shapes that you see here, the dark areas are the wings, and the large round clear area would be the bottle with the message in. So these are then released into the air to fly using these wings to catch some air currents. Pollen is so small that it can also be moved by pressure gradients, thermal, so air rising, warm air rising can bring pollen with it. But of course, the main mover and shaker of pine pollen would be the wind. They are anemophilous. And the conifers writ large, 130 million years ago, these were land plants along with the ferns and the mosses that had figured out this wonderful reproductive system using pollen, but there were no insects around at the time. Or what insects were around at the time, they hadn't made friends with yet. So there weren't really insect vectors for pollen. There just weren't. They weren't available. Eventually, there were some insects that tried to make alliances with the gymnosperms, but it didn't really catch on, and it didn't catch on well enough to have survived to today. So today, our living conifers or gymnosperms produce male cones that throw their pollen out into the wind. Here we have 4 female gymnosperm cones. The upper left is the ginkgo, perhaps you've heard of, and it's got this pollination droplet. Next to it is taxus, which is U. Below that is juniper and white cedar. And all of these female cones are producing these, what are called pollination droplets. So the pollen that's on the wind in mass quantities is going to get stuck to these pollination droplets. They're very sticky, they're resinous. And then the female cones can actually draw the pollination droplet back in, pulling any pollen that would be stuck to it in with it. So this is very different from what the flowering plants do. This is what's happening with those female cones. The male pollen in various species all adapted to being carried on the wind. So you can see the white cedar has naturally kind of not withered, but dehydrated to create this non-spherical shape that might be more easily blown about. We already saw the pine with the inflated bags or sacs, the saccate pollen of the pine. The Douglas fir pollen looking something like a red blood cell. And hemlock also dehydrated into this kind of rice cracker shape that easily catches the wind. So you can see the little line there is a single, very, very 520, no, millimeters, very, very small. Anyway, the conifers throwing their pollen out towards the female cones. The female cones adapted to grabbing the pollen out of the air and drinking it back in order to facilitate pollination and eventually fertilization and the creation of the seed. But you can hear all about that in a different lecture too. Now, flowering plants, generally speaking, the flowering plants appeared around the time that the insects were really getting their acts together and really realizing that this exoskeleton and flying were some pretty cool inventions, and the insects were taken over. And the flowering plants had the opportunity to take full advantage of that. And so most flowering plants are really co-evolved with insects who have eyesight, of course, and can benefit from plants producing easily observable structures and features that suggest some sort of reward, some reason for visiting these showy reproductive structures. We're zooming in on a tulip here, and here's an insect's eye view of its goal, not the pollen, The insect is looking for a nectar reward. And in white light, as we're seeing here, there is a bullseye to the base of these pollen-bearing structures where the nectar is produced. That's where the insect is going to hit head. And then it's going to look for the same pattern and texture, and it will inevitably visit the same species because it will be looking for basically this big, it even looks like a McDonald's sign, red and yellow, right? It knows what it's going to get for the amount of energy that it outputs. It knows what it's going to get back in. And it's going to accidentally get covered in pollen. And then it will accidentally kind of transfer that pollen to the next flower. The anthers are where pollen is produced in flowering plants. That's what they're called. And pollen is still that messenger, that message in a bottle. And like I was saying, in most plants, flowering plants, this transfer is facilitated by insects. And we've all seen big showy flowers built to attract pollinators. If we look closely at the pollen itself, here's the pollen of the flower that we just saw, Cosmos, a popular annual garden plant. Much further north, if there's anyone here from the Panhandle, you can probably grow these. But if you look closely at the structure of the pollen, it is built, in this case, to make sure that it will adhere to whatever pollinator insect visits these flowers. Pollen has external structures that help pollination. And in the case of this particular plant, because we happen to have electron microscopy images, we can observe the modifications to the outside of this pollen grain. Of course, that can help attach to the insect visitor. The bees and their kinfolk, the wasps, are naturally covered in hairs. They're sensory hairs. They can pick up vibration and humidity and all sorts of external signals with these hairs, but they're also quite good at accidentally getting covered in pollen. Some species of bees, of course, will collect pollen. It's very nutrient dense. It's worth eating if you're into that sort of thing, for an insect, I should say. Anyway, the fact that the bee is hairy helps, and the wasps, that helps have the pollen stuck to it. But what about the wind? What about the anemophilous species? Well, almost all of the gymnosperms are anemophilous. Like almost, like 99%. That releasing of pollen into the wind, female cones that have the pollination droplets that can draw the pollen in to facilitate the pollination and the fertilization of the eggs, that worked so well, or worked well enough, that was never supplanted in the conifers, in the gymnosperms. That method of pollen transfer was never supplanted by insect pollination. And I did mention before that there were occasional attempts. I can't remember the kind of insect that was modified. Its mouth parts were modified to transfer pollen in conifers. It was something strange, like a lacewing, that anyway, it just didn't work out. And to be quite honest, the gymnosperms didn't really work out either. There aren't that many gymnosperms left. And as far as diversity, they were outcompeted by the flowering plants. Not to say that flowering plants, after having come up with this wonderful complex reproductive organ called the flower, didn't kind of evolve in reverse away from the pollinator attracting characteristics of the flowering plants that you and I can see from a distance, there are flowering plants that are anemophilous. Not many, but the reasons for evolving towards anemophily make perfect sense. The oaks are an anemophilous group of flowering plants. We are currently under siege by the falling male catkins, strands of male flowers that don't look to most people anything like flowers. They are flowers that are reduced to only bearing one of the essential parts, the stamens. So each one of those little chains that are falling by the millions right now off of oak trees are a string of tiny little male oak flowers. Oaks, and being anemophilous, are releasing their specialized, very lightweight pollen into the air in clouds. Flowering plant pollen has loads and loads of diversity. For sticking to a potential pollinator or being carried on the wind. So there's a whole study of plant pollen in and of itself, and the proteins that are on the outside of the pollen grain, the architecture of the outside of the pollen grain, the type of folding on the outside of a pollen grain, and so on. It can be diagnostic. We can use that pollen structure to help decide what groups of plants are related to each other based on their pollen structure. In anemophilous, I'll go ahead and use the big word, in anemophilous flowering plants, these are flowering plants that are going to throw their pollen out into the wind, very often have got extensions on the outside of their pollen grains that are meant to assist in sticking their jump, sticking their landing, so that when they're tumbling through the air and they come across the surface where they are meant to live, there is some provision made to make sure you don't go anywhere once you land. And that can come in the form of spikes and proteins that have an affinity to the surface where they are about to land. And it's these spikes and proteins on the outside of these anemophilous species pollen that can often interact with our respiratory tracts in a very negative way. Not intentionally. It just happens to be that our body doesn't like these proteins, these structures invading our nice little soft airways. And thus is the hay fever or the seasonal allergies. Here's a look at the ragweed, an anemophilous species with that armature on the outside of its pollen grains in particular. So let's look at some examples of some anemophilous flowering plants that have gone backwards. They forego producing expensive petals. They forego producing expensive nectar. They just produce masses of relatively inexpensive pollen, and they poof it out into the wind. The flowers lacking petals and sepals can sometimes be reduced even further, like in the oaks, where only male flowers are produced on one part of the plant, and only female flowers are produced on another part of the plant. So the male flowers lacking the female reproductive bits, and the female flowers lacking the anthers that produce the pollen, those are referred to as imperfect flowers. They're still flowers, but they're imperfect because these over here, they lack the boy bits, and these over here, they lack the girl bits. Here's a catkin of male flowers. Anemophilous flowering plants. The wind pollination is best suited, really, to dense, low diversity landscapes, savannas in particular. And we do have savanna habitat here in Florida, and we have a very robust anemophilous group of flowering plants that live together in our savannas. Think about this, low diversity. So it's likely that many of your neighbors are going to be the same species. So you can just send them this message on the air, and your message is probably going to hit the intended target. Grasses and oaks, both anemophilous species. The grasses, again, we don't think of them as flowering plants because they're anemophilous. They don't make big, showy, petally flowers with colorful this and that and nectar and, pollinator garden and la, 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 la. Because they're anemophilous, they have these tiny little, very efficient, reduced flowers, but they're still flowers because they have those reproductive parts. They have anthers, and they have the lady bits, remember the stigma and the style leading to the ovary with the eggs in that's going to be the seed. They have all this. They are flowering plants, and grasses are, as a group, anemophilous. I think there's one bamboo that's still insect pollinated, but the grasses diverged very soon after becoming a group of flowering plants into being anemophilous, and they've stayed that way. Grass flowers, of course, aren't that much to look at unless you're a lover of grasses, which is perfectly acceptable. You can see the anthers here on kind of a teetering, very, very thin fiber. There's the thin fiber, barely connected to the anther itself. So the anthers are free to wiggle in the breeze and shake all that ripe pollen out into the wind. The female flowers are topped with these feathery stigmas, like a feather duster. Listen, they're feather dusters that are pulling dust out of the wind, and that dust is vital for their reproduction. You might be familiar with finger grass. These are the finger grass flowers. Inflorescence, this inflorescence of the finger grass. Lopsided Indian grass, again, look closely, you can see the kind of rust-colored anthers dangling, ready to zip out into the wind. And if you were to look even more closely, you would find that feathery stigma that is meant to grab lopsided Indian grass pollen out of the air to create the seeds of the grasses that we know as grains. So the grasses as a group, including some cultivated species like wheat and rice in this slide, wheat, rice, corn, oats. These all depend on wind pollination. These are all grasses. Wheat, rice, corn, and oats are all types of grasses, all anemophilous species. So along with an appropriate, or along with a habitat that lends itself to anemophily, dense and low diversity, anemophily also requires copious production because a lot of pollen will be wasted. A lot is going to end up on automobiles, let's face it. A lot is going to end up on the surface of water. A lot of it is going to go into the respiratory systems of anything that has lungs. So pollen there has to be an economy of scale in pollen production. in order to make sure that things happen correctly. And for the species, for the anemophilous species, even in a low diversity, dense landscape type, you got to get your timing right. So your message being sent on the wind has to knock on the door of a receptive recipient of that message, or the whole system breaks down. And yet, talking about flowering, you yourself put yourself in the position of an anemophilous species like this birch, beech. Anyway, you're not going to want to get your own pollen on your own stigma. Bad things happen when you fertilize yourself. Bad things can happen when it's not the best case scenario. So individual plants, you, the anemophilous species, might ripen all of your pollen and send it into the air in a matter of days, and then drop all those male catkins. And at that time, you can switch on your female flowers and change the receptors on that stigma so that now they are willing to accept and not reject any pollen that lands on their receptive structure. So that's a temporal way of handling things so that you don't get your own pollen on your own self. But you still have to hope that within this 6-week period, synchronized flowering happens across your species, and that another member has a different timing, another member of your species has a different timing, and that your pollen will drift to a receptive female flower. Another kind of requisite for anemophily, the habitat, the synchronized flowering, the copious pollen production, also need to put those pollen bearing flowers and the pollen receiving flowers, you have to put them out there. You can't have them hidden down in a canopy. You have to be where the wind can get in order for wind pollination to work, right? Makes sense. Ragweed does just that. If you're familiar with ragweed, the flowers are produced on very erect stems that bear the male and female flowers. Here, look, they're actually doing just what I'm doing. Look, you can see the little flowers doing just that. Pointing downwards, they can drop the pollen, falls by gravity, and catches the breeze, or electrostatic currents, or temperature gradients, anything that's going to draw the pollen away from the parent plant and get them to the receptive female flowers somewhere else. Those flowers need to be exposed. What they don't need to be, and what they typically aren't, is very colorful, or very noticeable, or very large. All those things are economically wasteful for the plant. You don't need petals. They're expensive. You're not attracting, the wind could care less what color your petals are or how big your petals are. You don't need nectar. You're not trying to feed the wind, right? So you're making this a very economic, because you have to produce so much pollen in volume. It's why many people don't realize. Remember, we saw the ragweed pollen. A lot of people don't realize what's making them sneeze is the ragweed, because they can't see it. You can't see it. It's invisible by design. It doesn't want to be eaten. It just wants to throw a bunch of pollen out into the world. You don't see, so you can't associate ragweed with your allergies, even though that's what's causing them very often. You're going to blame something that you can see. And traditionally, in the Northeast, ragweed flowers at the same time as goldenrod. And so people blame the goldenrod for their allergies, when in fact, goldenrod is not anemophilous, and goldenrod pollen cannot leave the plant unless it's stuck to an insect. So if goldenrod is making you sneeze, it's because there are bees in your nose. And you would probably know that. I mentioned the feathery stigmas of the grasses. Here's an example of one of those feathery stigmas I'm not making this up. Here we have photographic proof of the feathery stigma that acts just like the feather duster. So again, either electrostatic or just chance encounter. There could be, in some cases, in addition to the increased surface area that a feathered condition affords, there could be a little bit of sticky, resinous, viscous texture to that feathery stigma as well. So let's take a quick look at some Anemophilus species that's blowing around Central Florida right now. No doubt you're familiar with the oaks and the oak pollen. This is not an accident. This is not a special year. This is by the design of the ancestral oak that bestowed anemophily onto all oaks that are around in the world today. The male catkins releasing those clouds of pollen into the air, hoping that they will land on the receptive stigma of the female flowers, hopefully of a different tree. Same species, different tree. And here are the female flowers of a typical oak. It's just, look, talk about economics. It's an ovary and some kissy lips. It's got the kissy lips and the ovary, couple of random hairs, period. These kissy lips are going to receive the messenger in the form of wind-borne pollen. And then after pollination, the arrival of the pollen and the germination of the pollen, and it finds its way into the ovary, the sperm then finds the egg cell, chick-a-boom. This fruit begins to grow, which of course is the acorn. Very humble beginnings for the acorn. We've got in Pinellas County, our tiny little overly developed county, we have 11 species of oak, and we have pretty good populations of each. And each one of these are going to be releasing pollen at their own synchronized time. You probably recognize a lot of these from where you live. These are Florida pines. These are, sorry, am I saying pines over and over? I'm trying to talk about oaks. Rewind, insert, cut, paste, oaks. 11 species of oaks in Pinellas. Perhaps you notice some, perhaps you recognize some of these oaks. Chapman's oaks are some of the scrubby oaks. They only get to be about 6 or 8 feet tall, multi-trunked. The sand live oak is like a live oak, very huge evergreen, one main trunk. Various scrub oaks, the turkey oak, laurel oaks, a little oak, dwarf live, one of the running oaks, water oaks, one of the short-lived with the big trunk, myrtle, tambien. So all of these are poofing out. All of these oaks are poofing out all of this pollen right now, just in our little county. Pines, for real, we only have 3 here in Pinellas. You have a few more up in the Panhandle, but generally speaking, there's only worldwide, as I was saying, there aren't that many conifers left. They couldn't outcompete with the flowering plants. Despite the fact that some flowering plants stole their gig and became anemophilous, they still did it better. Our pines in Pinellas, ironically, point of pines, Pinellas, the longleaf pine and its lookalike, the slash pine, and then our sandhill scrub pine, the sand pine. Wax myrtle is an anemophilous species. Wax myrtle has little boy They look like cones. They look like a cross between a male pine cone and a male oak catkin. Just little brief pollen factories that can send. It's interesting, though, that in the wax myrtle, the flowers are produced very, very close to the stem and not out on the tips of branches. So they're kind of not following the rules, but apparently it still works because the female flowers obviously do receive pollen and go on to ripen into the wax-covered fruit that we know of the wax myrtle. Lamb's quarters, this is one that actually gets mentioned on at least my local news when they do the pollen forecast. They'll tell you that lamb's quarters is flowering. Lamb's quarters, Chenopodium, a group of anemophilous plants, the amaranth group of flowering plants. Perhaps you've heard of the amaranth group. It kind of flowers all the time. It's kind of like ragweed, doesn't really have a season. If it's growing around here in a waste area, a spoils area, disturbed area. So it's just a weedy species. I mean, I've got nothing against it. I'm certainly not judging it using these descriptive terms, but that's where you would encounter lamb's quarters. And some people know that lamb's quarters is, related to spinach and apparently quite tasty. Another anemophilous group are the nettles. We have a plant called Bommeria, and we do have, I believe, a couple of others in the Urticaceae. The proper stinging nettle is found in more temperate areas than we have here in Pinellas County, but we are not bereft of members of the Urticaceae. They also make these tiny little, very easily overlooked, almost intentionally overlooked flowers belonging to this family of flowering plants, the Urticaceae, the nettle family. Grasses we've mentioned before, blowing around back here behind me, masters of anemophily, hay fever. This is the hay of the hay fever. These are the major pollen producers, and certainly make huge contributions. Cattails are not in the grass family. Shame on me for this slide. They're in their own family. Let's just go right past that. And I mentioned to one of my colleagues here at the preserve today that I was going to be doing something on wind pollination. And the first thing that came to their mind was dandelions. And it's funny, I said, actually, I am going to be talking about dandelions. It's funny you should say that. But it's funny, not funny, in that what's happening with dandelions is not pollination. What's happening with dandelions is the subject for another lecture on another day. This is wind dispersal of ripened seeds within even a fruit. So dandelions are not demonstrating wind pollination by a long shot. Dandelions are insect pollinated species, but then they switch and they use for their dispersal mechanism a very inexpensive dispersal mechanism known as the wind. So the little dandelion fluff, those are flying ovaries. Flying ripened ovaries with a single seed inside. Each one of these little dandelion fluffs is a fruit, a dry fruit with one seed inside. So just so we're clear, right? Probably close to finishing up time. Wrap it up with the fact that people do talk about pollination. They do talk about wind pollination. Pollen gets a really bad rap, but there's really it's a brief window, usually, of when the majority of anemophilous species are active. Remember, part of being anemophilous is synchronizing your flowering. There are a couple of annoying species like the chenopodium and the ambrosia ragweed that tend to flower throughout the year. But as a general rule, anemophilous species just have the one go. But when pollen is brought up, it's usually brought up negatively. And look, we made the news. Florida, the worst pollen city. How would you like that? Really casting a pall on pollen, which isn't necessarily all that duly awarded. You will be getting some links. Thank you for signing up for today. You will be getting some links. One of them is to our Pinellas County Extension YouTube channel. We have a whole lot of topics that we cover in what I attempt to be an hour or under an hour. But if you look at some of these, an hour 7, an hour 29, I really got carried away, an hour 21, hour 23. Subject matter that you can just take and chew on as you wish. So that's the UF IFAS Extension Pinellas County YouTube channel. Those are all available all the time for free. I have to put in a plug for our Brooker Creek Preserve. Please do come and visit us and our anemophilous and otherwise species of wildflowers, both upland and freshwater wetland. Our sister preserve is Weeden Island. That's our coastal preserve in Pinellas County. We're known for our vast coastline, and it's certainly the driver for our economy, our beaches. But thankfully, there were some forward-thinking individuals that carved out a little bit for preserve down in St. Petersburg, so you can go and visit wild coastal species there. My boss produces a podcast if you like to learn that way, in the car or in your head at the gymnasium, a podcast called Naturally Florida. So that is a Polk County and Pinellas County natural resource agents, my boss Lara and Shannon over in Polk County. And they very regularly update their podcast, Naturally Florida. Hope you'll check that out. The shameless self-promotion is pointing you in the direction of a field guide that Lara and I produced together on very commonly misidentified or easily confused species of plants and animals. So how do you tell the difference between this or that? And that's what it's called, this or that. So you can visit the IFAS Extension bookstore for more on that. Tomorrow, the 16th, you can sign up for an online Zoom with Weeden Island Preserve, our sister preserve. It's going to be called Before They Were Native. I've done that lecture for this group before, just a brief history of how did we end up with the plants that we have? What makes the native plants native to this place? What forces ended us up with our native plants that we're so fond of? I really appreciate your time. I hope I haven't gone too far over the time limit. I do see that we have a question in the Q&A, so I'll go ahead and look at that. How do I feel about the plastic containers people hang out to attract and view hummingbirds? Is this invasive to flower pollination? I live in a part of Florida where our hummingbirds are so few and far between that we just kind of recommend that people plant a flower instead for the one hummingbird you might see per year. More of it's probably an easier sell to try and convince someone that it's just a little bit of a waste of time and resources when it would be much more rewarding to grow a plant that might attract hummingbirds instead. So I hope that gets close to answering your question. Anything else?
I have a couple questions for you personally, James.
Sure.
And first of all, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. We've gotten quite a few comments from people just saying how wonderful the presentation is. And I have to agree with one of the comments, the videos of the pollen dispersal were just really cool to see. And no wonder we're all suffering from allergies. And for anyone who's interested, the links that James gave out, Rose did put those in the chat, but we will be sending that out in the resource sheet that we'll send in the email with the link to this recording. I have a couple questions. Is it fair to say that wind pollination is a more effective means of getting the pollen to the plant, or a more effective means of reproduction than traditional insect pollination?
No, it's perfectly great way of putting that. And I think it's in balance. I think if anything, wind pollination is slightly net negative. Otherwise, the very crafty and fast reproducing flowering plants would have taken greater advantage of it. There would be more than 12% of flowering plants having gone towards wind pollination. It did favor those species like the oaks that live in the habitats that makes the best sense. And in more tropical, very thick understory, thick canopy, very rainy environments, you're not going to see wind pollination at all. It just think the rain would take all the pollen out of the equation almost immediately. So because there isn't, I'll stop there. I think we would have certainly, if it were that great of an advantage, we would see more flowering plants having taken advantage of it. But because of the way that habitats are on our planet currently, we only have X amount of flowering plants that have. The pines, the conifers, they didn't have a choice. They only had one option to move their pollen around, and that was the wind. And that, coupled with flowering plants, high reproductive rate, the fact that the conifers, the gymnosperms, had kind of experimented and failed with being herbaceous and reproducing quickly. They were trees. They only had one shot at it every year. That kind of led to the gymnosperms being outcompeted by the flowering plants.
All right. My other question is, you mentioned the potential negatives of self-pollination with these plants, and as some of them do produce flowers and pollen at the same time, is there anything that it built into the plant that would protect it from accepting its own pollen?
Sure, and the mechanisms are various and vary from species to species, but included are things like the pollen being self-rejected by the plant. You know, the plant could recognize its own pollen on its stigma and reject it that way. Very often it's that temporal thing where the female flowers are just turned off. And even though pollen might land, the flower does not produce the chemistry that allows the pollen to germinate. So there's various mechanisms to prevent self-pollination, but not to say that it doesn't happen. And worse than that, and kind of frustrating when you're dealing with the oaks, hybridization is not uncommon. And sometimes getting a proper identification on an oak tree in the wild can be difficult because it might be showing signs of two different species of oak because they have this wind pollination syndrome, and some pollen slips past the guard rails and will actually form a viable seed that, thanks to chance, grows into an adult. So that's not unheard of either. So yes, there are mechanisms against self-pollination. Not to say it never happens, but something else that happens is hybridization.
And that's when sand live oak pollen enters the stigma of a water oak flower.
Correct. And a viable offspring is created and actually survives to adulthood. It is going to have characteristics of both its parents. It's unusual. It's certainly attempted to be guarded against, but it's not to say it doesn't happen. It's actually quite convenient if you're in the field and you don't know what species of oak it is, you can just say it's probably a hybrid and sound really intelligent, but it's very
I
likely.
use that, yes. We do have a couple more questions in the Q&A. Just a reminder of whether the saccate is the male or female part of the flower of the plant. Excuse me.
Right. Saccate is a descriptive word for the pollen of the pine tree. The pollen is saccate, which is the male part. The pollen is released by the male cones, and it is referred to as saccate by having those little Mickey Mouse ears and a big glass sphere in between.
And then what happens if there are no other members of the same flowering plant nearby to receive the pollen, I would assume?
I know. Yeah. It's just tears. It's just tears that not unheard of. It just means that particular species obviously isn't going to get very well established in that area. Its distribution is going to come to a dead end with that individual. But when you think about, in our lifetime, that could be sad. But when we're talking the millions of years that our native ecosystems have been set up, everything's pretty much found where it wants to be.
Great. And well, the last question, I think they're asking about the live oak. How do the giant oak species with moss reproduce? I assume that's the live oaks.
Right.
But, kind of addressed the oak reproduction.
Well, interestingly, oak trees, of course, produce acorns, the fruit of the pollination, and acorns, they don't last very long. They can't wait years to germinate. They usually can't live, an individual seed can't live more than a year. So that seed has to get underground as soon as it comes off the tree, or it will never germinate. The best vector for that, of course, would be a squirrel, taking the acorn far away from the parent plant and burying it. But then that squirrel has to get eaten and removed from the equation so that it doesn't go back and dig up the seed and eat it. So there's a lot of chance, and it's very reasonable. You see why oaks have to produce copious amounts of seeds, because the chance of one making it to adulthood is very, very low. So.
Well, we can thank the forgetfulness of squirrels for that.
We can, or the keen eye of the hawks, or the forgetfulness of the squirrel.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much. This has been quite fascinating. I still have to get my head around the fact that wax myrtle is wind-pollinated. I did not know that. But thank you for coming back and presenting with us again. We hope to have you back again. You have so many wonderful topics that I know our supporters would love to learn more about. So hope you'll come back and join us.
Indeed.
And for those of you, again, who've enjoyed this presentation and enjoy the programs that we offer, please consider becoming a member, giving a donation, or purchasing that state wildflower license plate. All of that helps us do this and so much more. Thank you all. We will see you next month.